currents of the Gulf Stream that we were talking about, it would have flowed into the bays on the west coast of Atlantis, and on the side of the island, the seabed rose more gently than in the east, where the land platform sort of comes to an abrupt end, and the mountains rear up in a hugely sort of unscalable vertical wall, basically. But the Gulf Stream provided a never-failing supply of beautiful, warm blue water, and it brought about a gorgeous sort of quite mild and very damp climate to the whole coast. The temperature of the waters would have probably been identical, in this beautiful, hot, damp region, and it was exposed only to the sort of the mild west and southwest winds. The cold water current that would have always been bathing the north coast of Atlantis, it always brought with it sort of very cold bodies of air, and this would have brought rain and snow, to the higher mountain region, which then on the southern side of the mountains was a beautiful sheltered plain, and rain and snow accumulated in the form of glaciers, and then the streams would have flowed from the mouths of these huge hanging glaciers, and when the mountain wind blew, melting water flowed, in a great abundance down the mountainside, and then springs would have welled up from the ground, and clear water would have beautifully poured over the rocks. To obtain sort of a clear picture of the pattern of the climate, you'd look at the isotherm map of this region, and at a scale of 1 to 20 million, it gives sort of an outlined. If you look at a map sort of this region, it gives a map of the isotherms at the time. And if we look at pollen samples of plants and things back before the deluge, the very southern tip of the island would have had about an 80 degrees Fahrenheit, with a mean temperature of about 60 degrees Fahrenheit running through most of all the section before all the mountain range, and the whole island would have always remained in a region of around about 50 degrees Celsius, and just a little ways above the island, of course, then it would have ran into the 40 and 30 degree Celsius range, which on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, both in Europe and in North America, it does show that all this at one time was sort of all under ice, but then, as we said, that in the Gulf Stream barrier island of Atlantis was sunk, it then caused all the colder air and things to be changed quite radically, and then the ice would have melted quite a bit. And it's amazing because Plato talks about a mild fruit that grew there, and probably also grapes and things grew there too. Evidence was that they did make sort of intoxicating sort of liquids, so that probably could have been alcohol. But there's I'd say that probably the mild fruit that's talked about in Plato's reference, it probably fits more the description of the banana, and a type of banana called the Pacobo was just sort of recently sort of more or less discovered in Brazil, which is within the immediate cultural ambience of Atlantis. But it grows wild and regularly does form seeds, and then it doesn't really need to be artificially propagated by means of cuttings and things, or to grow from sucklings, from roots, which is the only way that it grows today. The modern banana has been hybridized so radically. But it was just a very demanding, warmth-loving sort of plant, and it would have been found in the southwest plains more of Atlantis, which had climatic conditions that would have allowed it to grow. That would have been more or less in the region of 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, or between 20 and 25 sort of Celsius isotherms. It would have been where the Gulf Stream was deflected by the coast, and the annual variations in temperature must have sort of been fairly negligible there. It's quite possible that, because the Atlanteans had ships, quite very large ships, which there is evidence that the Egyptians made very huge ships back then as well, and that Egypt and various other places of the world were just colonies of Atlantis. But Plato's mild fruit kind of not necessarily been easy to identify, but there's no such real difficulty about a nameless tree whose fruit yields a drink, food and oil at once, and that can have been probably the coconut palm. And like the banana, it's a typical tropical plant which is extremely sensitive to any drop sort of in temperature minimum and things. But the plant grows, on the coast of Africa and South Asia, but not really north of the Guinea arc. But where the banana can grow, the coconut palm it's a beautiful home as well. And they flourish, in the West Indies archipelago still to this day, as they would have done very beautifully on the southwestern plains of Atlantis. There would have been beautiful giant reeds, which more or less is a favourite food of the great pachyderms, and there would have been a climate of mangroves that would have sent aerial roots through a tangle of swampy undergrowth, as it does sort of in the Amazon Delta. And orchids would have provided brilliant patches of colour, and hippopotamus and crocodile would have been at home there, as also elephants would have been as well. Today, the elephant really is found in India and Central Africa, but in the lifetime of Herodotus, they were still found in northwest Africa, and it's written in Herodotus' writings that the land at the rest of Libya towards the west has more wild animals in the forests than the land of any herdsman. For the eastern part of Libya, which belongs to nomads, is low-lying and sandy up to the river Triton. But from there to the west, the lands of the farmers is full of mountains, forests, and wild animals, enormous snakes, lions, elephants, bears, and all sorts of things. But there was little hippos and things that sort of were right up in even South America, and there were mastodons. In Europe, there were sort of proto-elephants. It's perfectly natural to sort of assume that not only elephants, but presumably African varieties lived on this beautiful large island, which had just such a gorgeous climate. And then also now to this day sort of quite rare sort of creatures and things. But it would have included mastodons and tapirs and hippos and rhinos and other sort of numerous other sort of creatures, But the the people of Atlantis, we don't really know anything much about the human inhabitants of Atlantis region, but there's no means of proving either the presence or absence of such peoples existing during the Quaternary Age. But all the tribes we've been talking just a bit about, they have really marked features of a fairly common sharp profile of what's called the aquiline nose, and they had beautiful black hair, usually wisping, sort of growing back from a more sort of receded forehead. These sort of modern India sort of has features similar to this, and so does sort of the Mayan ancestors, and they're depicted on sort of many sort of reliefs that exist still to this day. But the cave paintings in Spain and Western France show sort of that show quaternary animals. In the pictures of humans, there's almost sort of an expressionless sort of features, but the males are always fairly tall and long-legged and sort of powerful, and you could have said that Cro-Magnons were very distinct from other European races. They were very distinct from the Neanderthal and the organic man, and they had a superior sorts of weaponry and that sort of thing. But they colonized Europe from the west, and it can be shown today that is so because of evidence from caves of how the Neanderthals retreated and things, and dating that's occurred. It can show that these Proto-American sort of Indian type of people, which are the Atlanteans, that populated Europe, came more from the west, and their skin was sort of like a red-brown skin, which paintings and things show an unmistakable sort of racial characteristic of the Red Indian, and they were sort of fairly giant, size in relationship to other people. But it is interesting that Meganthropus, there is a lower piece of a jaw which has with 3 teeth, was found in the island of Java some time ago, and this is a very huge person, huge in relationship to people today. But the average height of the European Neanderthals was really only about 5 foot 3 inches. That's about 160 centimetres, and they were very sort of thick and sort of, you could say, sort of strong-boned, like sort of pygmies. So it's interesting that the Atlantis world power at the time, it can be shown from symbols and things that were used all through North America and Mesoamerica and the top part of South America. And then you've got in the armpit of Africa and all the way down the very southern end of Africa, South Africa and Europe, were all places, where we have remnants of symbols and language, which has sort of like, shows a common mother tongue, which it's hypothesized, of course, that the Atlanteans, brought a lot of their culture and ways and things, to a lot of these regions. The Basques are said the last relics of a more beautiful, freer, sort of prouder world, perhaps long ago sunk, below the sea, together with Atlantis. But their beautiful aquiline appearance of the Basques is echoed in the profiles of sort of the old Mayans. And anyway, of course, they have also some very similar characteristic sort of methods of agriculture that the Basques still use to this very day, which is quite ancient, and it's an efficient method of sort of tilling their fields. And according to Solomon's story, they didn't plough, but instead they used layers. That's what he calls it, which today we know was a two-pronged sort of fork, which they just loosened the ground with, and they loosened the ground before beds were sort of sown. And it's interesting that the Mayans still to this very day and the Basques have a similar sort of way of doing their agriculture. Other things sort of like, which is similar, is the game of pelot, which is a national game by the Basque. It's a game sort of where the rules couldn't be more simpler, although it demands sort of great possible skill. But even children play pelota against available walls today. But that seems like it can have been a game that was played in Atlantis, because it's a similar game, as I said, in two faraway places which are today separated by quite a large stretch of sea, the Atlantis. But sometimes the ball was bounced repeatedly from one person's buttock to another person's buttock, and the strained postures of the players resemble sort of those of sort of jumping frogs and monkeys, But Atlantis and all of its achievements have not sort of completely sort of really disappeared, and a lot of that can be sort of shown through various cultural similarities between peoples in South America and Mesoamerica and Europe to this day. But the geological evidence of Atlantis is that, when you put the South American and African plate together, they fit perfectly, and so does the European, Greenland and Canadian plates. But the plate between Africa and a little bit of Europe and Canada and America is missing a huge chunk, which these shelves don't sort of really match. They, as I said, they only match in the South Atlantic and South America and Africa, but not in really the North Atlantic, which really this evidence sort of plays a fairly important role in our understanding of where Atlantis was. But a huge hole at the moment, sort of northeast of the structural basin of Mexico, is found really between Africa and Europe. And on one side you've got Canada, and on the other the shelves of the North Atlantic, and that they can't really be matched without a due allowance, more for the Atlantic ridge that existed. So that's another evidence to show that this is a piece of land that really was sunk beneath the sea. The shelves that match the Atlantic ridge is like a rectangular parallel sort of projection, and if you look down at the atlas, it shows that early tertiary position of the shelves before the first continental drift began. The shelves are a perfect fit of the edges of the Atlantic ridge, but only in the only in the patch sort of North American basin. It indicates sort of a subsequent sort of subsidence of land that used to be there. And then I would correct what we were talking about before, about as far as Charleston being the epicenter. Of course, South Carolina, I think I said North Carolina, but South Carolina, Charleston was sort of like an epicenter of quite a few rings, which can be shown by aerial photographs of enormous barrage of rocks from the heavens that ploughed their way into that region. Let's see. The geological evidence of an early tertiary catastrophe can have also been followed sort of by a second, and a glance of the U-shape of the Patagonian drifts reveals this. But it's interesting also that animals that lived in a very temperate region within a very short period of time in the Andes, all perished over a very short time, frozen. But could we imagine that as this asteroid hit, it pushes the whole of the continental shelf of America on the eastern seaboard side a couple thousand feet down, and it rocks the western edge thousands of feet up. It's like a seesaw that once this asteroid hit and it sunk a lot of land on the eastern seaboard side, it caused the rivers, which today, if you fly under the cloud cover, which I've done across South America, you can see how the rivers used to flow across the South American plate and exited in big sort of gulf areas, which is thousands of feet under the seawater today, and causing the plate to rock and be pushed down thousands of feet on the eastern seaboard side of the Americas, caused an upheaval and raising of the plate on the western side, and that can explain how it's possible for all of a sudden all these little hippos and things that have been found there can have perished as they did sort of fairly quickly over a quick period of time.